Hello. I thought I'd say a few words before we start the special podcast proper. Don't worry, we haven't replaced Chris Fisher as the credits guy, but I just wanted to explain a little bit about this podcast. It's a one-off podcast dedicated to marking our 100th birthday. It doesn't consist of case law, has no analysis, it certainly doesn't qualify for CPD points. It does contain things that I've learned through doing the podcast series, and which I wanted to chat about, in case anyone out there is thinking of doing a podcast series of their own. So, on with the show. Hello, and welcome to a podcast devoted entirely to me. No, that's not true at all. We've been thinking about how we wanted to mark the 100th podcast episode, because however you cut it, it's obviously quite a landmark. As you know from the podcast, I always like to share thoughts around whatever cases we're discussing, but also just general stuff, concerts, books, etc. So I want to say a few words about why we're doing the podcast and what we hope to achieve by it. I'm hoping that if anyone out there is thinking of doing a podcast on employment law, or indeed any other subject, they'll get some encouragement from it. And I thought I'd do it in the form of 10 things I've learnt during my 4 years of doing this podcast. The background to that was I started listening to podcasts in 2011, 2012, a whole range of issues, history, music, comedy and so on, and arrived one morning at Woking Station car park, plugged myself into the latest podcast episode or whatever I was listening to walk off to the Woking Station itself, and stopped dead. It's not often you can say you had an epiphany in a car park in Woking, but I can claim that it happened to me. Because it struck me there was no earthly reason why we couldn't do an employment podcast on the flood of cases which come out every month, which we have to read up on in any event, just to stay on top of things. So I came into work and expected to find that there were firms out there already doing podcasts, or that someone would come up with a very good reason why we shouldn't do it. But much to my surprise, there didn't seem to be anyone else out there doing employment law podcasts in 2012, and nobody in BD blinked. So basically, having convinced myself it was a good idea, it was up to us to make it happen. And there were definitely some rocky moments. Trying to persuade the Law Society would also qualify for CPD points, which again seemed to me a very sensible way of selling the podcast, took some doing. We then had fun arguing about the name. I was very keen on calling it the Woking Classes, but sadly, Mayor Brown had better ideas. So, 100 episodes in, plus a number of guest podcasts. What have I learnt from doing this series? Well, rule number 1. Let's start with the sensible rules. It's harder work than I expected. We have for many years in the team had a fortnightly training session covering cases reported in the previous couple of weeks, which we discuss and what's their impact for clients. I thought I would simply then select the key cases coming out of that meeting and go and talk into a microphone later that morning, and out would come the podcast. Of course, the thing that you realise when there is no live audience, you have nothing to fill the gaps with, no energy to feed off while you're working out what you want to say next. So you have to be more organised and planning in advance if you're going to do this. Rule 2. Conversely, rule number 2, it's much more fun than I thought it would be from the start. I remember waiting to do the first podcast and being really nervous before it went out, thinking we were going to get deluged with a flood of rude comments about how can you think this case means that, or rude words to that effect. Of course, the world continues to turn, and the people that listen to it only say nice things about it, and that's fine, of course. It's fun. I enjoy doing them now in a way I never thought I would do. So if you're thinking of doing a podcast series about anything, do see it for what it is. It's fun, not a chore. Rule number 3. You have no idea who listens to the podcasts. That again took a bit of getting used to. As you know, the podcasts are up on iTunes and YouTube, so they are accessible, freely accessible by anybody. We have no idea who listens to the podcast series, and the listener stats seem to go up and down largely at random. But you meet people who just part of working, who refer to listening to the podcast or have seen episodes of the podcast listed, even if they've not listened to it. That, frankly, is always a bit of a kick. Rule number 4. Rule number 4 is an exception to rule number 3. The only category of people who regularly write in about the podcast are those whose emails take a particular approach. They always start off by praising the podcast. They find them amazing and informative, and they always make time to listen to them. And then the email concludes, I'm looking for a trainee contractor, is there any way you can help me? 10 out of 10 for ingenuity, but I'm sorry this comes as a disappointment if you're listening to my podcasts in the hope of getting some assistance. I have precisely no influence over who gets trainee contracts at Mayor Brown. Rule number 5. Guest episode podcasts are much harder than they look. I've done a fair number of ordinary podcasts before we ventured into the choppier waters of guest podcasting. I think we've probably done about 10 of these now. People are often very happy to be asked, and people are always asked to talk about things they know about, and so they've all been genuinely very interesting. And I think it's really good to get a different view on issues affecting employment law. So in addition to having interviewed a number of barristers, we've had someone in from ACAS, for example, talking about the ACAS conciliation process. We had someone in from Women on Boards talking about their work to improve the rates of representation for women at the most senior level. However, it's much more difficult to interview someone than you might think. How often do you interject or murmur to keep the conversation going? If you do it too often, it sounds very odd when you hear it recorded. Trust me. If you don't say it enough, it sounds like you're having two separate conversations. But I would like to say a thank you to all the guests we've had on the podcast over the years. Rule number 6. The podcast can be hugely embarrassing to your children. I cannot emphasise this enough. My eldest son, who now probably qualifies as a youngish man, had to do a project when he was still at school on social media usage, and to his horror, one of his classmates found the podcast, and he had to endure the class listening to my podcast for a few minutes. So, yes, a good reason for making a podcast: embarrass your kids. Rule number 7. Have you ever realised how many unpronounceable case names there are in English employment law? I did not know whether I have a predilection for choosing Welsh cases or whether they're just more significant cases coming out of Wales than any other part of the UK. However, the number of times I've struggled with case names, and in particular Welsh pronunciation of a case name, I cannot tell you. Equally, I've had people writing in to tell me how I should be pronouncing the case names after the event. Beware of case names. Rule number 8. Also beware of tea trolleys. In the early days when we did the podcast, you had to do it in one continuous take. There was no ability to edit. So you couldn't, you either got the perfect take or you had to go back and do it all over again. On about my third podcast ever, I was sitting doing a recording. I was almost at the end, just starting to relax, and the door for the recording room was flung open, and a waitress brought in a tea trolley. Rattle, rattle, clang, clang, lots of cursing. I went back and did the podcast all over again. From then on, I always lock the door from the inside when we're doing the recording, which does mildly freak out some of the guests, it has to be said. Rule 9. Whilst we're talking about things going wrong under Rule 9, Rule 9. Whilst we're talking about things going wrong, Rule number 9. Do not discuss things going wrong when you're listening to other people's podcasts on your own podcast when you think they're not recording you. Because guess what? They are. I did a guest podcast with one of my partners here who does the pensions podcast. There was a break in the recording for one reason or another, and he and I were chatting. I mentioned I just listened to a podcast where unfortunately they'd managed to record a segment which was the two people on the podcast chatting casually, not realising they were being recorded. Yep, you guessed it. We were being recorded at that point, and when they came to put out the podcast, the whole lot went out, which was the cue for a fair amount of teasing from those who listened to the podcast. Richly deserved. Rule 10. Watch out for plot spoilers. Those of you who've listened to the recent episode of the podcast will know I inadvertently revealed a major plot twist in Game of Thrones for those of you who'd not seen the particular TV episode at that point. It was an ad-lib comment, and I assumed everyone was aware of what had happened in the Game of Thrones episode. I assumed wrongly. I then managed to compound this by managing to make sure that in the following episode I apologised for having revealed the plot twist and revealed it again, so someone who had only listened to the more recent podcast found out about the twist at that point. In the circumstances, I'm giving up on apologies. So, I think that's about it. That's 10 rules. I wanted to thank those who've helped me over the years with the technicalities of making a podcast. If it was left to me, I'd probably be handing out scripts and Bishopsgate. I'd like to thank those in BD for supporting this. I'd like to thank the compliance gnomes for not listening to this. One thing I want to make clear is that I'm profoundly grateful that people take the time and trouble to listen to the podcast. I would be grateful for any feedback or comments in an email or in person. I never thought I'd find myself doing this. It's a million miles away from the sort of thing I usually feel comfortable doing. But I'm really pleased we do them. So, here's to episode 200. Thank you.